All right, hello everybody. You have a favorite beverage ready. We're going to be having a fun night. We're learning a lot. I've got here OFW lead biologist Darren Clark. He's been working on ungulate research for quite a while now, and
he's going to give us today, and we'll let him get started.
All right. Well, thanks, Ryan. I'm going to jump right into giving the presentation here. So I don't know if my face is going to disappear from all you know or what's going to happen, but I'm going to share what I've got going on. And give me just a second to get through technical difficulties. All right. If anybody can respond to make sure that you can see this right now, I'd appreciate it. So I think I've got the talk up and going, and I'll get started here. So I'm Darren Clark. I am the Wildlife Research Program Leader for the East Region of ODFW. And just real quick on my background, and I think I might have a lag. My screen's up advanced too fast real quick. All right, look good here. So I am a native Oregonian. I grew up in Northeast Oregon, hunting and fishing out in this area, which led me to Oregon State University to pursue a degree in, got my undergraduate degree in fisheries and wildlife management at Oregon State University. Then proceeded to get my master's degree and PhD there as well. So I studied spotted owls for my master's degree, and then looked at elk and cougar relationships for my PhD. After that, I became an ODFW employee as a research biologist. I've been here about 8 years, and for the last 6 years, I've been our research lead for the East Region. Broadly, our research for ODFW, we focus on big game species and their habitats and how predators might affect their populations. In the last few years, we've been really focused on mule deer. They are, as you're going to find out, a species of concern for us as an agency. And so we've been spending a lot of time trying to understand what might be going on and why their populations might be declining. I'm going to start out with a bit of background on mule deer. And this is pretty generic background. Some of you guys that know mule deer pretty well, this is going to be pretty really low-level background information, but we might have a diversity of audience here. So I'll start out with some real basic stuff. So mule deer are one of our smaller ungulate species in North America. The females weigh about 110 to 160 pounds. The males get quite a bit bigger. They can be up to about 210 pounds. There's a north to south gradient in weights of the species, so you get some of the larger animals in the northern gradients and some of the smaller ones down in the southern areas, down in desert regions in southwest U.S. and down into Mexico. Most of the individuals are migratory, so they transition between high elevation summer range and then come down to low elevation winter range to avoid severe winter conditions and survive the winter. Most of the breeding occurs between November and December, and they typically give birth to fawns between June and July. Their fawns are about 7 to 10 pounds at birth, and twins are fairly common in the species, but they can also have triplets, and there are records of having up to 4 offspring in a single session, but they also have one fawn sometimes as well. So quite a bit of variability in their reproductive status. They are a wide-ranging species. This map here on the left shows the distribution of both mule deer and black-tailed deer. Black-tailed deer are a subspecies of mule deer that occupy more of the coastal forest areas. But mule deer range from their distributions now goes into Canada and it goes all the way down to Mexico. And they occupy, there's a diverse set of vegetation communities across there. You've got high alpine meadows down to sagebrush steppe habitat into actual desert areas down as you get to the southern reaches of the range. So broadly, they are a habitat generalist. They can occupy a wide range of habitats, but they do have very specialized diets, which is important for mule deer when considering how they persist in the landscape. Given they are a smaller ungulate, they have a very small rumen, so their fermentation chamber where they deal with all the vegetation they intake, it's smaller, so they can't take in a lot of forage intake, say like an elk or a domestic cow does, and they need to really high grade the forage that they're taking in to get the most valuable energetic resources. They pack a lot of energy into a small space to try and get the resources out. So their diets are pretty specialized. They try and get on the highest quality forage that they can actually find while feeding. They also tend to be a bit of a boom or bust species. So this upper picture here, we're showing these are 3 mule deer fawns we captured as part of research. They got their blindfolds on, so they're a little less stressed. So not the most photogenic picture right there with blindfolds on their heads. But given this ability for them to crank out a lot of offspring at once, they are capable of rapid population increases under the right conditions. But they're also very susceptible to population crashes, particularly during severe winters or drought conditions where food isn't very good. The severe winters can really hit them pretty hard, where you'll see a lot of mortality in the adults as well as very little fawn recruitment. So they're prone to some pretty big swings in population size just due to their biology, so they can take advantage of good conditions, but they also are susceptible to crashing during bad conditions. Another important thing about mule deer is nutrition affects every aspect of their lives. So their ability to get quality forage on summer range particularly affects their reproduction, so how many fawns they can have, whether it's twins or triplets, the survival of their fawns, the growth of their fawns. It influences antler growth on bucks, overall longevity of individuals. They're in better shape, they can avoid predators better, influences their survival, home range sizes, and many other aspects of their life. So basically everything about them, nutrition sets the foundation for how this species is going to do from a year-to-year basis. But that's not to say that predation is not an important aspect. We have quite a few predators and mule deer in Oregon. I'm going to focus on those because there's also grizzly bears and things like jaguars as you move further south down into Mexico that also prey on cougars, but we don't have those here. Well, prey on mule deer, not cougars. So cougars are the primary predator of mule deer in Oregon. That's confirmed by our studies on cougars or whether we're studying survival rates of mule deer. Cougars kill mule deer of all age classes, so fawns, yearlings, and adults throughout the year. And if we look at coyotes, they're a little bit different. They tend to kill a lot of fawns immediately after the fawns are born, so the first 30 to 60 days of life. Coyotes will get quite a few of them when they're pretty small. After that, coyotes don't get near as many until winter conditions are suitable, that especially during crusty snows or deep snows where the deer are going to sink through, and the coyotes can stay on top of the snow. That's where they're pretty effective predators of mule deer during the winters. Broadly, black bears and bobcats tend to eat mule deer mostly fawns right after they're born. So about 30 to 60 days, again, they can prey on them, and then the fawns get big enough at that point that they can either get away from, say, black bears, or in the case of bobcats, they're big enough that they're a bit of a formidable prey for bobcat to take down. Wolves, which are relatively new, recolonists back to Oregon, they also kill mule deer, but in general, where elk and mule deer both co-occur, wolves tend to prey more on elk than they do on mule deer. But given they're new colonists to Oregon, we still have some things to learn about how wolves might prey on mule deer and elk for that matter. Broadly speaking, on mule deer populations, populations have peaked in the 1930s, 1960s, and 1980s, and this is throughout their range in western North America. Those are sort of the glory days of mule deer, as some people call them. In the late 1990s, we started seeing range-wide population declines throughout all of western North America. And as part of the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, there's 23 states and Canadian provinces where population trends are monitored for mule deer. Many of the populations are currently below management objectives. Population declines are still ongoing in many areas, including Oregon. But there are some areas where we're seeing some improvement in mule deer populations. So it's not all doom and gloom everywhere with declining mule deer. But as part of these declines, the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, that WAFWA acronym there, established the Mule Deer Working Group, which is made up of state professionals that get together and try and understand reasons why mule deer populations might be declining. That's been ongoing for about 20 years, and that Mule Deer Working Group puts out a lot of information that is useful. So I'm kind of wrapping up with my real background information on mule deer, but if you really want to learn more about mule deer and their management. If you just either Google Mule Deer Working Group or this link that's up on the screen right now, we'll get you to the Mule Deer Working Group, and there's a bunch of fact sheets in there. They're 1 to 2 page reads on various topics that kind of cover some of the nuts and bolts of mule deer and management. Also got habitat guidelines on there and various other things that are really easy for folks to read and get a handle on what might be going on with mule deer. So if you're interested in more background information, that's a great place to check out and get more information moving forward. And so with that, I'm going to kind of jump into talking a little bit about Oregon's population. This is Oregon's mule deer population trajectory since the 1980s. The 1980s are our last big peak in mule deer populations. As you can see, sort of some up and down there until about the 2000s, late 1990s, and then we start to see a steady decline in mule deer. Bit of an uptick between about 2014 and 2016, and then we had a very hard winter in 2016 and 2017, and the mule deer population declined quite a bit since then. Some of those hard winter events will have substantial effects on mule deer that have carryover effects. You lose a bunch of fawns those years, so you're losing some of your prime age animals moving forward, and reproductive rates might decline a bit. So there's a lot of carryover effects that happen with these hard winters. But regardless of that, we are seeing a decline in mule deer populations in Oregon, and it's of substantial concern, and trying to understand why this might be occurring is important. And overall, since the 1980s, we've seen about a 40% population decline, and we're currently at about 50% of our management objectives set by the state. So we're not where we want to be. We need to try and understand why this might be going on, and why might this be occurring. There's been plenty of hypotheses introduced as why mule deer might be declining. These are not necessarily specific to Oregon, but here's sort of 7 examples of what might be going on. Some of this might be related to winter range, whether this might be from human encroachment on winter range, so housing developments taking away winter range, lack of forage on winter range, just relatively just that declining quality or quantity of the winter range might be influencing mule deer. There might not be enough forage on summer range. Nutrition is important for mule deer and other ungulate species, so we need to have enough forage out there for them to meet their life history traits. Predation could be a factor. Cougar populations have recovered from near extirpation in Oregon and other places in the western United States to very robust populations at this time. Black bears have followed a not quite as extreme trajectory, but they have also recovered from pretty low numbers during the middle part of the 1900s. And we've got wolf populations also reestablishing throughout the western United States. So predation could be an issue. Overharvest and poaching could be an issue. Currently in Oregon, overharvest probably is an issue. We really don't harvest female mule deer anymore at this point, and due to their low population size, poaching is still an ongoing issue that we need to deal with. There's also the facts associated with climate change, so changing temperature and precipitation regimes that might influence mule deer forage. We've also got competition with other ungulates, particularly elk in some places, but also with domestic ungulates such as cattle and sheep that might be taking some forage resources away from mule deer on their native range. And disease, this one's not a particular concern in Oregon, but we have some instances of hemorrhagic diseases popping up here and there, but they're not sort of sustained long-term problems. The bigger one that might be on the horizon is chronic wasting disease, which is affecting mule deer herds to some of our counterparts to the east, where the disease is known to be present. At this time, we don't have any knowledge of chronic wasting disease being present in Oregon, but it's something we are on surveillance for to try and see if it's going to pop up, and then we need to deal with that in the future. So I'm going to switch gears a bit here. The first 2 bullet points I mentioned there might be of concern is habitat, so winter and summer habitat for mule deer. And some of this got addressed through what we call our South Central Mule Deer Study, which occurred from 2005 to 2013. During that time, we put GPS collars on 542 mule deer. The primary objective of the study started out initially related to migration corridors and vehicle collision hotspots. Because there was proposals to widen Highway 97 to a 4-lane highway, I believe, from Bend all the way to Lapine, and trying to understand where mule deer might be getting hit by cars on here, and maybe understanding where we need to put in some highway overpasses or underpasses to allow mule deer to migrate through and freely move through there without getting hit by vehicles. not really going to focus on those two topics. I'll focus on the last sort of three here, which are survival rates of mule deer, survival rates of what cause specific mortality, what are they dying from, but also looking at winter habitat use and summer habitat use. What are the features of the landscape that mule deer want to choose that they let us know that's the good parts of the landscape that are good for them. So jump right into survival. On the left here, we have just percentage of known mortality related to 4 primary causes. Predation, human cause, and that's primarily vehicle strikes there, so deer getting hit by cars. Poaching, and then natural, those are malnutrition, disease, other sort of factors that deer die of. And as in most studies, we find that predation is a common source of mortality for mule deer. The interesting thing from this study was that the human-caused mortality, whether between vehicle collisions or poaching, was actually the most common source of mortality when you add those two together. And that's not great news, and ideally that's something we can deal with either through overpasses to reduce some of those collisions or trying to get on better handle of poaching and trying to minimize that. The other key factor we found as far as survival goes is the difference between migratory and resident mule deer. Those mule deer that migrate to summer range have higher survival rates. This is largely driven by their ability to migrate to summer range where they can get higher quality nutritional resources compared to those resident deer, which are sort of hanging out in winter range year-round. So a lot is probably driven by forage availability and the ability for those migratory deer to put on more fat and be able to deal with poor conditions. But overall, the survival rate of this population was about 79%, which would indicate this population is declining. There's no doubt about that. You need to have about 85% survival of your does to kind of keep your population stable with fairly marginal recruitment rates. So fawns becoming a year old and becoming an adult in the population, you need to have, if that's fairly marginal, you need to have about 85% adult survival. And we're not quite seeing there, so this population has been declining for a while now, given that survival rate of adult individuals. So moving to winter habitat use, in this system, most of these deer are migratory, so they're now coming down to these sagebrush systems or a mix of sagebrush and juniper, and that's where they're spending their winters. And so when we're talking about winter habitat use, we're talking about how deer are choosing to use these landscapes with a mix of sagebrush and juniper, and what features on those landscapes are most important. And not to really get into statistical methods here, but the way this works is we take all the GPS locations of the animals and see where they're at. So these little black dots on that figure to the far right show where the deer actually were. And then we're looking at attributes of those circles, where those larger circles where the points fall. And so we're going to compare the circles with a lot of points in them. What are the attributes of that to the ones that don't have many or no points? And we're making the assumption that deer are going to the places that are best habitat for them. And so those attributes where they spend a lot of time will let us know what deer like to use on winter range or summer range or whatever else you want to do here. So basically you're saying, let the deer tell you what the good spots are and compare that to what the spots they don't want to be, and understand what characteristics are different between those two and what might be beneficial for mule deer. So the first thing we found, which isn't real shocking, is during the winter, mule deer avoid deep snow. That's the reason they probably are migratory. So they're trying to come down to lower elevation to get out of snow. Traveling in snow is very energetically costly, and then trying to find forage or having to dig through snow also uses a lot of energy for them. So they're coming down to low elevation, getting out of the snow. So nothing too surprising there. We expected that. One of the surprising things we did find, though, is that mule deer were seeking out forest cover in these landscapes. And in these cases, this tends to be juniper stands. And they were also doing this on relatively moderate slopes. So the reason they're probably seeking out some of this forest cover relates to intercept of snowfall by the junipers. In these areas, there's probably less snow depth, so they can move around easier. There's also probably some thermal cover benefits. So if you've been outside on a really cold day, getting up underneath of a tree helps you conserve some energy. You're not having everything just reflect into the sky. And so deer are probably doing the same thing. So this forest cover probably provides them the ability to save some heat exchange with the environment by hiding underneath trees and resting there. The moderate slopes also might relate to some of the snow depth issues. might be less drifting snow on some of these, and they can just access forage better, or there's just less energetic costs of moving around. The last thing we found of key importance was that mule deer were avoiding roads that were open to motorized vehicle access, whether this was ATVs, trucks, whatever. Any motorized vehicle can go down it. The deer tended to be avoiding these areas up to about a mile away from the roads. And what these roads are probably doing is it allows increased disturbance of the deer. So having people drive by causes them to flee or go try and hide. But potentially the bigger concern is that this reduces the effective habitat area. So if you have an area about a mile around a road that the deer don't really want to spend a lot of time, they aren't able to effectively use that area anymore. So you're just kind of taking that area away from them. Not just the road, but sort of a buffer around it. And given these deer are nutritionally stressed, having access to the best available resources that time of year is probably going to be pretty important to them. So this is actually a big deal that you're seeing deer try to get about a mile away from roads before they really start resuming their normal activities. So quick summary on these results here. I'm kind of going through a lot of information here pretty quick, but there's a lot to cover. So one thing that might benefit mule deer in some of these systems is seasonal road closures on winter range. This will allow mule deer to fully utilize the available habitat. You'll have reduced disturbance to them. They're already energetically stressed, so if they're having to move around more to try and avoid people, that just adds to what the demands on them to try and get through winter. The other thing that may be important here is having some of these road closures. Poaching is sort of a opportunistic activity, and a lot of it happens, people shoot something off a road and then haul it to their vehicle. So if you close some of these roads seasonally, there's less human access out there, and there may have reduced poaching rates, which having more deer survive the winter and not getting shot illegally would be pretty beneficial. The other thing we noted is that juniper cover appears to be important to mule deer on winter range, and there's a lot of work going on in sagebrush habitat to remove juniper to benefit sagebrush obligate species, so things like sage grouse. And given that mule deer are choosing to use these areas with juniper, these blanket widespread removal of juniper on winter range should be done with caution. We're not saying they shouldn't occur to benefit sage grouse either, but you need to look at the context. And given that mule deer were liking to use moderate slopes as well as cover, you could probably leave some of the juniper on these moderate slopes. Mule deer can then use it, and sage grouse typically are not using these sloped areas. And the other benefit of some of those junipers is just probably reducing the depth of snowpack from snow interception, so deer are having less energetic costs to try and get through the winter navigating through snow. Going to flip gears now and go into summer habitat use. So now when these deer are migrating back to summer range, they tend to be up in conifer forests, and so it's kind of a totally different system and might have different implications for what's important for mule deer. And sort of doing something similar as last analysis, we're just comparing where deer used to where they didn't use to get an idea of how they're using the landscape. So the figure here on the left is showing how you got a peak there at about 40% canopy cover, and that's sort of the ideal condition for mule deer in this situation. That's where they're most likely to be, but you have relatively high use from a range of about 10 to 15% canopy cover out to about 60%. So what this is really getting at is deer sort of like these intermediate canopy cover conditions on their summer range. And that picture on the right sort of shows reduced canopy cover. And what's happening there is you're getting increased light penetration to the forest floor. So you're getting more forbs and grasses growing, more shrubs growing. So there's just more forage for mule deer in these areas. And so they can take advantage of those resources. Whereas you get into a high canopy cover forest, there's not much forage out there. You get way too open. You end up with a lot of things that mule deer might not want to eat, like a lot of grasses. And deer are also exposed out in those areas, and they might want to actually use some of the thermal cover benefits on summer range, so being able to get in the shade during the day and not have to be stuck out in the wide open sun when it's hot. The other thing we saw is deer using these forest edges. Again, this probably provides them more access to forage, but then they can transition back into hiding or thermal cover pretty quickly without having to travel long distances and incur more energetic costs to get from where they want to eat to where they might want to bed down. So those are the two key primary findings. We also found that deer are using areas closer to streams and on flatter terrain. The benefit of being closer to streams, and these were both intermittent and perennial streams, is likely, again, related to forage. You've got probably some more water resources in there, which is now allowing vegetation to stay greener longer later in the summer. But you're probably also getting increased shrub production, which is also a key forage species for mule deer. Or not species, but forage group for mule deer. They're also using flatter terrain, which could benefit their energetics. They've also got fawns at that time of year. And their fawns might do better on flatter terrain than trying to get them on steep terrain where they might struggle to move around. So those are kind of the key things about our forage, well, about summer habitat use, and what this relates to for sort of a management or how do we manage the landscape for mule deer, is that forest management can benefit mule deer. We can create forest stands with moderate canopy cover and increased edges. That'll likely improve forage conditions for mule deer, give them better forage resources that they can survive better, accumulate fat for winter, and their fawns will probably grow better in those areas, given the increased resources available. But context matters here too, given that deer wanted to be not necessarily near water, but sort of those riparian areas and flatter slopes. You can kind of target some of these management practices closer to those areas where the deer also want to be. That'll probably get your biggest bang for your buck. The other thing we can do with these models that we develop looking at habitat use is we can make predictions on the landscape of how mule deer use of the landscape might change given some management applications. So if you actually want to go on the ground and do a habitat improvement project, this is sort of an example. So looking at the same spot here, got the before on the left and the after on the right. You're going in there and thinning these understory conifers to get more light penetration with the forest floor and allow increased forage production for mule deer, elk, or any other ungulates that might live in the area. And so you're basically going from a state of low nutritional quality and quantity to a state of higher nutritional quality and quantity, which should benefit mule deer. Excuse me. The other thing you do, these are some predictions. So the sort of green to red colors here are predicted use. So you go from low. So those red areas are areas mule deer don't want to spend a lot of time. The green areas are where mule deer would want to spend more time based on the underlying conditions on the landscape. If you go to pane number 2 to the upper right, we show how the existing tree canopy cover is there. You kind of got that in the dead center. You kind of got that sort of triangle shape there where it's low canopy cover. You go in there and maybe plant some trees or get trees growing again in these restoration areas, that lower left pane. That will increase the canopy cover to a level that would be more beneficial to mule deer, sort of in that 30 to 40% range. And you can see you go from that red color down to more of an orange color. So you can improve the habitat that way and sort of assess how this works. You could also do the opposite where you're looking at a thinning project. Say if you got a really dense canopy cover and sort of plug that into this equation, get the information back to say that will improve conditions for mule deer based on what we know from the model we developed. So you can kind of use this information in a land use planning scenario to say, if we go out there and do this treatment, it's going to do this to the overstory canopy cover. How might that benefit mule deer moving forward? And we've worked with our land management partners with the Forest Service to try and implement some of these models when they're trying to do vegetation treatments throughout the national forest. Well, the Cascade National Forest, not everywhere. Sort of the area outside of Bend, sort of south out of the California border where we did the work we did. So now I'm going to change gears again, getting to some different information related to the research we're doing at the Starkey Experimental Forest and Range. And real quick on some background on Starkey. It was established in the late 1980s. It's about 40 square miles total. The area where we do most of our work is about 30 square miles. So it's a pretty big area, well within the home ranges of both mule deer and elk. Surrounding this whole area is an ungulate-proof fence. And so now we can control the population sizes of both mule deer and elk fairly well in there. We've got a contained population, which then allows us to do experimental studies. So we can directly manipulate vegetation, deer elk population size, or any number of metrics to have more of a controlled experiment where we can't control a lot of those things on the larger landscape. But broadly, this is an area typical to dry interior forests in the Blue Mountains and a lot of other areas in the western United States and So it's not a unique situation, other than having a fence around it and being able to do controlled experiments. And this is a joint project. It's been ongoing for 30 years now, 30 plus years, between ODFW and the Forest Service, trying to address management-related questions to benefit mule deer and elk. So our current work at Starkey is largely focused, the overarching theme of its competition between mule deer and elk. So how might elk be affecting mule deer, or do they at all? We just wrapped up our phase 1 of this research, where we had about 350 to 500 antlerless elk in our main study area. That's one of the highest densities of elk observed in the Blue Mountains at the time. We've concluded that data collection point. Now we're moving to phase 2, which is our treatment phase, where we've substantially reduced the elk herd. So in June of 2020, we had about 125 to 150 antlerless elk left in the main study area, and after this winter, we're going to be down to about 75 to 100 elk, which now we're getting down to lower end densities in the Blue Mountains. So that's the overarching theme of our research, is to focus on this competition effect. But simultaneously, we're collecting demographic information on mule deer throughout this whole research project. So we're looking at survival rates, pregnancy rates, twinning rates, all sorts of demographic components of mule deer populations. We're also looking at nutrition. So that relates to the nutritional condition of females entering winter, so how much body fat they have. We're also looking at forage on the ground. How might that change once we have fewer elk out there? Are we going to have more shrubs and other things for mule deer to eat? And also looking for changes in habitat use. Might mule deer start using areas that elk were excluding them from using, that might be some of the better places on the landscape to get energetic resources? And last part, we're looking at predation. So what predators are most commonly killing mule deer, and then how predator densities, they're going to vary a little bit over time, how that might be affecting mule deer populations in our study. Diving right into results here, the biggest thing we found so far with Doe Survival, this goes through 2018, is that snowpack was our biggest factor influencing Doe Survival. During lower snowpack years, our Doe Survival was around 80 to 84% most years. But during our severe winter, which is represented by that blue line there, which is our depth of snowpack throughout winter, that's where our survival rates really declined. And we got down to about, I think, 61, 62% survival of our does. So that one winter, we lost about 40% of our mule deer population just from that increased snowpack. So that's the biggest thing we've seen influencing doe survival yet. Other than that, it seems to be pretty steady across most years, which is fairly common what's been found in other study areas. If we look at fawn mortality and survival, we've got a lot of figures to go through here, so I'll start in the upper left-hand corner. This is just cause-specific mortality. The two colors there I'll get to in a second, but we've got two different group of fawns, but the basic take-home there is the bulk of fawns are being lost to predators, so coyotes, felids, that's primarily cougars. I think there's one bobcat kill in there. But we've got a lot of other things going on there. We've got some disease issues that happen. We've had at least 2 fawns trampled to death by elk. And then we've had several just unknown mortality events. You just find a whole fawn carcass just laying there on the ground with no real explanation to why it died. If we go down below that to the lower left corner, we now look at the sort of timing of mortality. So most of our fawns are dying the first 30 days of life. If they can get sort of past that threshold, they seem to do pretty well. There's a little bit of a peak out there at about 70 days. I'd attribute that more to small sample size than anything biologically meaningful. But that's basically it. We lose most of our fawns really early on. And that seems to be the key time when fawns are dying. Trying to understand why that's occurring is going to be critical. So looking at fawn survival after 120 days, so we have a control and a treatment group. And basically what the treatment group is, those does have access to better forage on winter range than the ones that are in the control group. And what we find is the fawns that are born to those does that have better access to forage during winter have higher survival than those that don't. And then overall, our average survival rate is about 35% for fawns out to 120 days. So we're losing 65% of our fawns before they're 4 months old. And that 120 days is meaningful. That actually comes in as the date that a fawns actually wean. So they're no longer really relying on their mother for milk and they're basically transitioned over to a vegetation-based diet. The key thing with that difference between the control and treatment group is that it appears that higher quality winter range will help. So we're going to have higher survival rates if we can get better quality forage to mule deer on winter range. And I'll move into now. There's a lot going on here, but it's pretty quick to explain. So I'm going to look at the simplified mule deer population and how these survival rates that we're observing actually translate into what the population is going to be doing. So we have 100 does, and I'm going to go down the left column there with the fawns. Each doe is going to give birth to about 1.5 fawns on average, so we're going to have 150 fawns born. 35% survive to winter. That's sort of our survival to 120 days. So we're already down to 52 fawns. We're going to have about 60% overwinter survival. That's pretty consistent across most of eastern Oregon. So now we're down to 30 fawns, but half of those are going to be males and 15 are going to be females or does, and they get recruited into the adult population. If we had 100 does, we're averaging about 82% survival. So 82 live through the year, but we're recruiting those 15 back in. We have about 97 does, so we have a 3% population decline. But I did mention that bad snow effect year. So if we have a bad year, same thing with fawns, 35% survive to winter. We're going to drop overwinter survival a bit because the doe survival declines as well. And ultimately, we're only going to end up recruiting about 10 does from the 146 fawns that were born. The really bad news is we lost a bunch of does. So we had 97 does, 61% survived. We're down to about 59. We're going to recruit 10. We only had 69 does in our population after that. So we had a 29% population decline. So these severe winter events are really important for mule deer. They can really knock us back a long ways. We lost, in this example scenario, we lost about 30% of our population in 1 year, which is not good news. And why this might be happening is it does tie back into mule deer nutrition. Nutrition, as I mentioned earlier, is sort of the foundation for mule deer populations. This figure here, we're just showing dietary digestible energy on the y-axis there. So the values going vertically just shows kilojoules of energy per gram of vegetation. And this is across 5 different vegetation types. And we got 2 spring seasons and 2 summer seasons of sampling here. The values aren't critically important at the moment. What is really important is this information here. So that yellow line going across the top represents the energetic demands of a lactating female. The vegetation that was available in our study area is not sufficient to support the energetic demands of a lactating female. As a mammal, that's pretty important. If you don't have enough energy to give additional resources to your offspring, they're not going to survive well under any circumstance. They're going to grow slowly, not trying to make mule deer into human or anthropomorphizing this, but if you've got a hungry baby, it's going to make noise. And if these females aren't able to produce enough milk, they're probably going to have offspring making a lot of noise, which might attract some predators, make them more susceptible to predation. A lot of carry-on effects there that could occur by the fact these females don't have enough forage energy available to them to support their lactation needs during the summer. The blue line there represents the baseline requirements needed for a doe just to maintain her own body condition moving forward. We met those in most years, but that summer of 2017, we're getting down there where we're barely meeting that. So during those years, those does are not going to be able to put on much body fat, which is going to allow them to survive better moving into summer, or moving into winter. So if you have more body fat in the winter, you're more likely to survive those adverse conditions. And these does are not putting on much body fat, so they might be more susceptible to winter kill just because of the lack of forage on their summer range. So ultimately what this tells us is we need to have better forage in our summer range if we really want to turn around this declining population that we're observing in our study site. The other thing that's important here, and I'll get to the figure on the right here in a second, but what we did find with the mule deer at Starkey, these females were finding the areas with the best nutrition in the landscape based on where we went out and sampled vegetation. So they were actively spending time in the areas with the best resources. And then the does that were in the best of the best available, they entered winter with more body fat. So deer were making good choices. They were finding the best forage, and if they had the best home range, they were the fattest individuals moving into winter, which is important. The only downfall is the habitat we have out there doesn't meet their nutritional needs. So it wasn't very good habitat. What this does is set up this cascading series of events that occurs. So their habitat determines the nutritional resources that are available to them, and this ultimately determines their fat reserves or their nutritional condition of the females entering winter. And if this then sets off a cascading demographic consequences. So if you're really skinny, you're probably less likely to get pregnant. You're going to have later born fawns because you're probably going to enter estrus later, if at all. Then after that, you're going to have slower growth rates of fawns, which then influences their ability to survive both through the summer and then entering winter, because that influences their body size throughout that. And then you also ultimately have survival of the adults themselves is influenced by their nutritional condition. And all these combined have influences on your population growth rates or the size of your mule deer population. And that framework just really sets out how habitat and ultimately nutrition can have effects throughout the whole mule deer population without accounting for any other factors that may be going on. Habitat and forage sets the foundation for how these populations are going to perform in the future. So what might actually be happening? This is actual experimental research done at Starkey, where we've gone out and conducted phenology sampling. And so phenology is looking at timing of green up, growing season, and the time that plants senesce or basically turn brown and are not really nutritional anymore for ungulate species. We did this between 1991 and 1996, where the average temperature throughout those years was about 42 degrees Fahrenheit, and between 2015 and 2019, where the temperature had increased 2 degrees Celsius, 2 degrees Fahrenheit, to about 44 to 45 degrees. And the first figure in the upper right corner shows the increase in temperature, mean temperature at Starkey between 1990 and 2020. We've seen about a 2 to 2.5 degree Fahrenheit increase, as I just indicated. And what this is translated to is it appears to be affecting our growing season for plants. So the figure on the lower left represents the length of our growing season for forbs. And we've seen that the growing season is about 23 days shorter in the late 2010s as it was compared to the early 1990s. So we've lost about 23 days of our growing season. This is a similar pattern for grasses, and this occurs across grassland, open pine, and mixed conifer vegetation types. The figure on the lower right represents forb senescence, so the timing of when these plants sort of turn brown or of lower nutritional quality. This has happened about 17 days earlier. And ultimately what this means is we have a shorter growing season, so plants aren't producing as much biomass, so there's less food out there available to both mule deer and elk. But we're also seeing this stuff turn brown sooner, so it's of lower quality for a short, but lower quality longer. It's of higher quality a shorter amount of time. So we're losing both our biomass and quality related to some of these temperature changes that are going on related with climate change. So this has fairly broad-reaching implications. If we're not producing enough forage quality and quantity, that's going to affect the nutritional condition of our deer and elk entering winter. How can we counteract some of this? Again, through some improving habitat. Climate change is the only thing that's going on. That figure on the left there really shows the state of a lot of forest stands in the Blue Mountains, where we've got a lot of conifer ingrowth, where there might have been timber harvest or some other disturbance in the past. Now we got this dense understory conifer layer. There's really nothing in there for mule deer and elk to eat anymore. If you go in there and thin some of that out, you're going to see increased light penetration of the forest floor, and you're going to improve the forage resources for mule deer and elk. So ultimately, a take-home here on mule deer and summer range, what we're seeing, at least our study area, is that nutritional resources that are currently available only allow mule deer to maintain themselves at best. So they're going to have lower body fat entering winter, which is going to reduce the ability of these does to survive the winter. We also see that the available forage doesn't support the demands of a lactating female. And if you can't provide resources for these young, small animals, their survival is going to be pretty poor, regardless of how they ultimately die. They aren't going to grow very quick. They're going to be malnourished, and they're just not going to survive well. So based on our information at Starkey, we think summer forage is a strong limiting factor on mule deer, and this could be due to land management changes, climate change, a bunch of other things that could be going on, influencing forage resources. And we're working on trying to establish more of those links moving forward. So I don't want to leave it all doom and gloom there, given that mule deer are capable of rapid changes. So if we go from our current average year, you can get a good year in here. You don't have to change a whole lot. If you get better forage conditions, the does might have a little bit higher fetal rates. You produce a few more fawns to start with. If you increase survival rates 10%, you end up with 70 fawns left instead of 52. Entering winter, you might have a bit better overwinter survival with better nutritional resources. And ultimately, you're going to now recruit 26 does into the population, and your adult survival improved a bit too. And now might hit conditions where now you have a 14% population increase without changing anything substantially as far as the percentage of animals surviving in the year. Just take some of these small changes to sort of tip the scale a little bit, and maybe we can get things turned around the right direction to get mule deer on an upswing, which would be beneficial. So some of you who are familiar with mule deer are probably going, this guy hasn't mentioned predation yet, and we're not trying to avoid any sort of topic here, but I freely admit predation is the most common source of mortality for mule deer. You can go across the western U.S., Canada, any studies that have been done, predation is typically one of the top sources of mortality. So not dodging that fact, when we get to Oregon, what we see is that cougars and coyotes are the primary predators of mule deer. As I mentioned earlier, cougars prey on mule deer year-round, and they are fully capable of killing every age class from fawns up to adults. Coyotes, typically most of that predation occurs in summer on the fawns, but during the right conditions in winter, they can be a pretty heavy predator on mule deer during those years too. Those are typically those deeper snow depth years with crusty snow conditions. The coyotes stay on top, deer sink through, and make the deer pretty susceptible to predation. The issue with predation is it is very messy, and I might dive into a topic here that is more of a theoretical biological topic. Some folks might not be interested in, but some of this relates to how deer populations are from a nutritional stress standpoint and how predators might influence them. So if we have deer populations that are nutritionally stressed, predators are likely going to kill a lot of the animals that have died anyway. So these might be animals that died during malnutrition during winter, might be fawns that weren't growing fast enough, they're going to die from something. So these predators are killing some of these animals, and this is compensatory mortality for other forms of mortality. So the predators are simply killing animals that would have died of something else. This is most likely to occur when deer are nutritionally stressed. If deer populations are not nutritionally stressed, there is the scenario where predators are now going to kill many animals that would not have died anyway, otherwise. So in these cases, we're now talking about additive predation. Well, predation is now an additive source of mortality. So basically, baseline death rates, the predators are going to add more on top of that. And that's the situations where you're going to get predators that are going to negatively affect population growth rates of their prey or population size. So this is trying to diagram this a little bit more simple. Still a lot going on here. So if we go on the additive side, what we would predict to happen is so let's say cougar density was decreased, or the number of cougars was decreased, you would expect to see fewer mule deer killed by cougars, so there'd be less cause-specific mortality. But then you would see no change in the non-cougar cause mortality, which would lead to increased survival rates of deer. So cougars are killing fewer, and there's no other offset there. All the cougars that were killed, all the mule deer that were killed by cougars would have survived anyway, so you'd have increased survival. On the flip side, if you have compensatory mortality going on, you decrease the cougar population, you would again see a decrease in cougar-caused mortality, but then you would see an increase in non-cougar-caused mortality. So this would be things like malnutrition, or some other factor is going to step in there and keep your mortality rates the same. At that point, you'd see no change in survival. So that's sort of how you'd assess whether something is additive or compensatory mortality from a predator standpoint. Either when you reduce cougar densities, deer survival increases, or when you decrease cougar densities, there's no change in deer survival. So this takes a lot of data to figure out, but it can be done. So this is an elk example from Oregon. This is work the department has done with calf survival in Northeast Oregon and Southwest Oregon. And there's a lot of figures going on here. I'll start in the upper left. What we're showing here is that calf survival to 12 months declines as you increase the cougar-caused mortality rate. So the greater percentage of calves that are killed by cougar, survival rates decline. Below that, if we look at the blue triangles there, we're looking at how black bear cause mortality rate. There's really no relationship there. It's a bit of a downward trend, but it's really messy. Basically, what we're getting at there is as you increase the percentage of calves killed by black bears, that really doesn't influence the survival rate of calves. From that, we conclude that cougar predation is additive and black bear predation is compensatory. And we see this further looking at the cougar predation with the figure in the upper right corner, whereas we increase cougar density, we see a steady decline in calf survival. So if there's more cougars on the landscape, they kill more calves, and we have reduced survival. That indicates cougar predation of elk calves is additive mortality. So this is an elk example. We're here talking about mule deer. What about mule deer? Well, at this point, it's to be determined. This takes a lot of data to establish these relationships. And one of the key things we need to do is establish carnivore densities to tie back into how changes in carnivore densities might influence survival of mule deer. We have established these methods. We have some pretty good methods worked out now, and we're currently working on generating density estimates of carnivores in the Starkey system from 2017 to 2020. That's still ongoing. We don't have those done yet, but we're still going to need some additional years of data to account for variation in carnivore densities and variation in other factors going on in the landscape. You know, if we have a hard winter again, that might be unrelated to how many carnivores are out there. And so we need some longer time series here to really understand this relationship before making a definitive determination of what might be causing that. So we're working on it. We're not discounting the effects of predation, but it takes us a while to really get at predation effects compared to some of the other things, just because studying carnivores is really difficult and time consuming, and it just takes us a while to get there compared to where we're dealing with a bunch of collared deer. We can get an inference a lot faster as far as what's going on. So predation's still on our minds. We're working on it, but I don't have any real strong results to share anything yet, other than to say at this point in time we know cougars and coyotes are the primary predators of mule deer. So real quick summary on Starkey research. What have we learned? We know that weather matters. Those severe winters are important events. That's not unique to Oregon. That's been found throughout mule deer range. Habitat and summer nutrition is important. That sort of sets the foundation for productivity in mule deer populations. Not only mule deer, that's also true for elk and other ungulate species. So they need to have high quality forage during the summer. I think that climate change is affecting forage resources available to mule deer and elk for that matter. So that could be important moving forward. Forest management, going in there and dealing with some of the ingrowth of vegetation we've had from lack of long-term forest management and fire suppression could also benefit mule deer, get more light to the forest floor, get some more forage out there for deer. And we do know that cougars and coyotes are the most common predators, and that's what we know on the predation side so far. What do we have left to do at Starkey? We need to continue to look at how predation might be linked to mule deer survival and ultimately determine if predation is additive. And we'll do that on a species-specific basis, so we'll look at both coyotes and cougars. Given the low rates of predation we saw from bobcats and black bears, they're sort of lower on the to-do list compared to assessing how cougars and coyotes might be affecting mule deer. And finally, last thing, given our overarching theme of the research at Starkey is to look at competition with elk. We need to tie that back in now. Now that we've done our elk reduction, we're going to start getting some information and see if mule deer start doing a bit better when they have less competition out there for forage resources. And with that, I thank everybody for tuning in, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen now so I can see what else is going on, because all I can see is my PowerPoint. And see if folks have questions, which I'll let somebody else moderate here.
All right. Can you put me? Yep, I'm back on. Thank you so much. I think I speak for everybody when I say that was amazing. It's amazing research that you do, and we are all very thankful for your efforts. That was even better than I expected. It was very informative, and you are, and your research is a treasure, and we truly appreciate it. I'm going to get into some of the questions here. Some of them are slightly duplicated, but we'll start with the ones with the most upvotes first. and I know you're limited on what you can talk about as far as policy as a researcher, but we'll go through them, and then I did a little bit of the policy research as well, so you can kind of defer a little bit, and then I can and follow up with people if it's something that I can't answer. The first, the one with the most votes is a pretty generic. It's a big question, and it's how do we make more mule deer? Example, underpasses or more grazing lands. What is the top one or two things, and is there anything we can do to help?
Uh, uh, that's why I do the research I do, is to figure out how we can make more mule deer. The there's some context here on what might matter in different places. So if you look at different parts of the state, if you get in the Bend area, I think really trying to understand that highway mortality is very important for that population there. And yeah, in that situation, underpasses probably are really beneficial. You get out to rural southeast Oregon, not many deer are getting on highways, just you don't have many cars out there to hit deer. So it does vary a bit where you place to place. From my viewpoint of what we've learned in Oregon, that you look at other places in the West, nutrition is sort of that foundation. So having proper land management practices to try and increase forage resources for this species is going to help them from a productivity standpoint and survival for the adults as well. And that's going to vary place to place. So sagebrush systems are not going to be the same as you look at forested systems. If you're out in the forest, increasing light penetration to the forest floor is going to be important to get more browse species growing. Sagebrush systems are going to be a bit different. We may have to deal with exotic annual grasses out there, different treatments out there. Some of the juniper removal on summer range might be beneficial there to, get more forage species for mule deer to grow. They can't eat juniper. So it is context specific, what's going to be the most important. And that's kind of what we're trying to work on, is trying to understand how can you benefit some of those habitat conditions to actually make more mule deer out there and reverse the trends we're seeing. And so, I'm going to stay a bit out of the advocacy things on what you guys can do. What I would promote is stay involved, understand what's actually going on. These forums like this, you guys get information to understand what's going on. From my view, that's important. How you guys want to use that information, I'm going to leave up to you as a citizen to go out and do what you think is best. And I'm going to stick to my role as an agency biologist at the moment.
Just real quick, a little bit of an add-on to that question. You said that populations were rebounding in some areas. Are you familiar with what research has been done on what the conditions are in those areas, and is there potential replicating?
So another easy question. So again, it's all context specific. A lot of places where they've seen some improvement. Some of these have been in desert systems where they've just reversed drought conditions for a while. So the deer were getting hit really hard by drought conditions, got out of the drought, the deer sort of bounced back a bit. There's some evidence of some habitat improvement projects working. And so a lot of it just depends on context. And some of it's just dumb luck, it stops being dry and you're going to get more deer all of a sudden in a desert system. And I think even our own data in ODFW, we got lucky last couple years. We haven't done comp surveys yet for this coming year, but I know the herd comp surveys in 2020 were some of the highest we'd seen in a while. And part of that was probably related to the fact we had probably better growing season conditions the summer before. It was a wetter spring and lasted longer in the summer. We probably had more green forage out there longer. I don't have any hard data behind that, but I just remember that's what we were seeing up at Starkey. We had a longer growing season. Our fawns tended to survive better that year. So there's a bit of dumb luck in there, but I think some of the habitat management practices that can try and be promoted to try and, especially in forested areas, will be beneficial, regardless of where you're at in mule deer range. If you can key in on some of the things that might be degrading habitat, turn some of those around, it's not going to hurt anything for mule deer, that's for sure.
All right, and then we're going to give you a slightly easier one to transition. Do your mule deer populations that you included in your presentation, does that include blacktails as well?
No, there's no blacktail information included in there. I leave that to my counterpart. That species gets studied by my counterpart in Western Oregon. So yeah, this was all mule deer information in this presentation.
Yep, and then there was a question here on how much of an impact invasive annual grasses like Medusa head and cheatgrass have on the winter range impact for forage quality and survival.
Again, a complicated question. So those the green up of those non-native species is a bit different. You know, cheatgrass greens up different time of year, and deer will eat those. But the question is whether those are then sort of affecting the abundance of native grasses and forbs that they might want to eat other times of year when those are actually greening up. So I don't have a great answer on that. We are currently engaging in some research where treatments have been done to reduce the non-native annual grasses, and this is going on winter range to see how mule deer might respond to that. So just starting that up. I don't have a great response other than it could be a mix of things. Having that green forage from a, say, cheatgrass during a different time of year than things usually aren't green out there might be beneficial. And does that offset any losses in native plants? I don't have a good answer on that, but it's a good question. We're diving into that one.
Okay, and then another big one is what are the impacts of non-motorized travel, especially running, biking, backcountry skiing? I'm going to add one to that too, shed hunting. What the impacts, or have you guys done any research? Like I've seen some out of Colorado when it comes to elk survival and recreational travel. Have you guys seen anything on that, or do you know of any studies regarding that for mule deer?
So the bulk of the work that's been done has been on elk, and we've done work at Starkey. I was not directly involved, but directly looking at elk responses to various recreations. So it's ATVs, hikers, horseback riders, and there are effects on elk. Deer respond a little bit differently. Elk have pretty strong response. They have big flight distances. They'll try and get away from people, and they actively move. Deer, they're more have a hunker down sort of strategy. And some of the work we have done at Starkey related to how they respond to hunters reflects that. So we put GPS collars on hunters at Starkey, followed them around, and then also looked at how deer and elk responded. And work that we just published, I think last year, showed that the deer response it's pretty confined. They don't really have big movement responses. They like to stick to their home ranges, so they're going to flee outside of their home range. They might have a short distance flee response, and they're going to hunker down again. And more what we see with the mule deer side of things, at least from hunting, and these are does responding to hunters hunting bucks. They're probably giving up some foraging opportunities because they spend less time out in the open. They kind of just get into thick cover. And people that hunt mule deer probably know that's true. Once they feel pressured, you don't see them as often anymore, especially the bucks. And so there's some potential energetic cost there, but given the length of our hunting seasons, it's probably not a big deal. But it wouldn't surprise me if, mule deer are viewing humans as a threat, and that's why they are responding at whatever level they do. And they're probably going to respond to other forms of recreation, whether that be people out hiking, picking mushrooms, berry picking in the fall. That constant pressure of people being out there is going to probably lead to some chronic issues going on. And the summer issues might not be as bad. They might be able to make up a lot of that night, feeding at night when people aren't out there. The winter stuff is probably where I'd have the most immediate concern, just from the fact they're nutritionally stressed. They're just trying to get through winter. Being out there disturbing them at that point is probably not the best thing for them. But that's a long way of saying I don't have a lot of evidence on there yet. It's something that's on our radar, is trying to look at recreational responses. Well, response of mule deer to recreation. But it's on that long list of things to sort out that might be affecting mule deer, which the list is long.
Yeah, it definitely is. And I'm curious about primarily winter and then during the fawn season, during that time of year, running into issues with maybe separation due to flight and energy cost during that vulnerable period. But let's see, what's the next one? There are a number of them. Okay. Hold on. How does ODFW get poacher-caused mortality estimates? Were you able to hear me on that one?
Yeah, was it poacher-caused mortality?
Yeah. Well, how do you get those estimates?
So all of our estimates are primarily coming from collared deer, and that just relies on us getting out there and investigating what went on, which is the case for establishing any form of mortality, whether it's predation, starvation, getting caught in a fence, hit by a car. We get the mortality alerts from the collar. We'll go out there and investigate what's there. In the poaching situations, we find the collar, and it's clear that thing was a human took everything home with them. So it looks like an animal that was gutted and quartered or something, or just they might have taken the back straps in some cases. Some of the things you find at poaching investigations are really sad, from somebody just killing that animal for no particular reason other than sometimes they just shot it. You can just tell somebody shot it and left it. So that's where we get the bulk of those estimates. There has been concern about underestimating that because people might be destroying collars or other things. We don't have that many collars go missing. We usually track it down. The technology is getting better and better. We get alerts pretty quick when animals die with the GPS location where they're at. And if the collar moves, we can still follow it as long as it's out there. So, and we're pretty good when we're actually doing these studies. We have dedicated staff to get there as soon as possible because it is important for us to understand what that source of mortality was. And it's just like anything. We got to get there and investigate it.
Yeah. Nice comment, Paul. I'm there with you. The another kind of issue I would see possibly with that too is that collared deer is probably less likely to be shot than an uncollared deer, depending on the situation someone's shooting it in, because you're more likely to poach something you don't think you're going to caught. You see a collar, you're probably going to be a little less likely to shoot that particular deer. But anyway, moving on to the next question. In forest areas that were allowed for more light and understory growth, what was the type of foliage required for the population reproducing, or are there other less quality foliage taking over those areas?
So that was wrap my head around that one real quick. The biggest thing that happens is it's not necessarily less quality species that grow, but it actually is the case. You actually get a lot of conifers growing. So you get conifer ingrowth. They're just shading everything out. Early life stages, deer and elk will eat the tips off new growth of conifers, and they get some value out of that. But eventually they escape where the deer and elk can feed on them, and now you just got a bunch of conifers sitting there and nothing on the understory floor. Go out and plow through a dog hair thicket and look at the ground and see what's in there. There's not much. It's just thick conifers. So you're losing basically every other species besides conifers in a lot of these stands. There's some other things growing, but it's not real high density of plants for them to eat. And just over that forest floor, you get stuff growing back again. There's stuff sitting in the soil that's waiting to grow again that's highly palatable. There might be suppressed shrubs in there that get some more light on them. They're going to grow faster. So it's mostly in the forest environments, you're just getting this conifer ingrowth, and that's all that's growing. is these conifer species that aren't real palatable to mule deer or elk or anything else.
All right, thanks. Have you heard? So there was an article that somebody read recently that referred to the rose petal effect in mule deer. Has ODFW talked about translocation of mule deer in areas where the habitat looks good, but there are few mule deer?
One reason we don't like transporting deer anymore is disease issues. We move a deer with chronic wasting disease across the state. Now we got CWD there as well. So moving deer is not a real strongly advised thing anymore. So I'll start there. The second thing with mule deer is they have extremely high sight fidelity, which they typically learn from their mother. So they're going to tend to go back to places their mom took them. They're going to migrate the same path. You go drop a deer off in somewhere it doesn't know, it might not know how to find winter range. It might just die. The other thing we know, studies, not just in Oregon, but other places, when you look at deer when they leave their typical home range, they oftentimes get killed by predators. They don't know the surrounding area anymore. They're at much higher risk of predation once they get outside of the familiar confines of home, and that leads to lower survival. So I'm not sure dropping deer into a new spot would probably work out that well. I'll leave that at that.
We have a lot of questions here, so I'm going to try to pick through them. That research out of Wyoming, by the way, just as a conversation topic on mule deer and following the maternal pathways through migration is, where it's within 20 yards in a lot of cases. That was just amazing. But anyway, winter grazing by cattle is being utilized as a method of reducing invasive annual grasses in eastern Oregon. Many of these areas fall into designated mule deer winter habitat. How do you expect this grazing and the presence of cattle in the winter range to affect these mule deer?
I might punt on that one. We're getting outside of. I'm not familiar with the cattle side of that as far as cattle reducing annual exotic grasses. There's several that I know. One of the bigger ones coming in now is ventonata. Almost nothing eats ventonata, including cattle. And so I'm not sure on the side of the research of whether cattle actually do that or not. I'm not up to date on that one, so I'm not going to comment on that. Broadly, though, I would think a lot of winter range, if you could get rid of some of the non-native grasses, that would probably be beneficial. They might be crowding out some of the species that mule deer do benefit from. But getting back to a bit earlier when I talked about given the differences in growth patterns, particularly with cheatgrass that greens up at a different time of year, and mule deer will eat that, does that offset some of the losses you get to native grasses? We don't know yet. And I think some of that work we have teed up looking at how mule deer do respond to these herbicide treatments that are going out to reduce the non-native grasses, I think will help clarify some of that. But from the cattle standpoint, I'm going to avoid that one because I'm not familiar with that research itself.
Okay, thanks. And we have a lot of them that are heavily policy here that I'm going to spare you on when it comes to some of them that are clearly outside of the research realm. Let's see. I had one queued up here. Oh no, where'd it go?
Probably the top.
Okay. Do you believe that habitat can be managed successfully for both deer and elk at the same time, or is it best to manage specific areas for one ungulate species?
It is totally possible. The things that are going to benefit mule deer are probably going to benefit elk too, especially in the forest environments. Most of our elk herds in Oregon are restricted to the Blue Mountains and the Cascades and the Coast Range. And forest canopy cover for elk is a big issue, influencing the nutritional resources available to them. So opening up that forest canopy is going to benefit elk as well as mule deer. The question that comes into mind, which we're hoping to answer at Starkey, is if you benefit the elk enough, is that now going to have a detrimental effect on deer because there's too many elk on the landscape? Because elk are going to do better. They're even more. Their diet's so broad. They gain a lot more grass. They gain a lot more other things that mule deer might not take advantage of. But they're also going to eat the really high quality stuff that mule deer like to eat, which may be detrimental. So that you're going to benefit elk, and maybe they're going to be detrimental to mule deer. That's what we're hoping to try and figure out at Starkey by reducing the densities there. So hopefully there's some better clarity there. We've done work at Starkey looking at vegetation treatments. Both deer and elk start using them more. So if you're talking about thinning treatments and then maybe some understory burning on summer range, both deer and elk, our elk work is published, the deer work we're in the process of getting to publishing, but deer are also responding positively to those. They increase their use of them. So they both end up using it, but are the elk just going to be better at it, get more numbers of elk that negatively affect deer? That's the other thing we're trying to sort out. But the vegetation treatment should, especially in forested environments, should benefit both species.
And then we got a little bit easier one here, I think. As a current college student in a wildlife ecology and conservation sciences major, what path did you take to get involved with ODFW and in big game in particular?
Yeah, so career development, especially as a young professional, is always a challenge. Given there's more limited resources, it's getting more challenging every year. The agency does offer internship opportunities every year. That's a great way to get your foot in the door and get to know some people. The other thing I would strongly suggest is some volunteer time. Ask your local district if you can get involved with something. Even if it's just pretty limited, get your name out there so they know who you are, and try and keep up some of those connections. And I know volunteering, takes your time away from other things you might want to do. But there's plenty of interesting things we can do that we're oftentimes looking for help as an agency. Just getting more people out there. The other things that help is, even if it's not through the agency, volunteering with some of the conservation groups like Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, BHA. If they're out there doing like habitat improvement projects, there's often ODFW folks there on the ground that you could directly interact with, get to know, and that's just another way to get your foot in the door. The field in general is a lot of who you know, not what you know. You make those right connections. You might meet somebody in ODFW that knows somebody in a different agency or different place, and then you list that person in ODFW as a reference, and they know each other, which leads to good things down the road. So a lot of it's just commitments to getting out there, meeting some people, putting some time on the ground, showing you're a hard worker and dedicated to the profession, and it just takes a lot of work. It's a very competitive field. Getting your foot in the door. The other thing, depending on what you want to do career-wise, if you're looking to, there's a big split between management and research in the field, and if you're looking to do particularly the research side, you usually need to go to graduate school. If you're going to go that route, you need to make some different connections, sort of with professors, and try and understand, get involved with some of their research. Early on as an undergrad, volunteer to go out and help one of their grad students or something, really get to know somebody that way. So yeah, a lot of it's just networking. The hard part is people who are interested in natural resources might be doing it because we're not necessarily the best people. We want to be out there in nature doing our thing, and getting away from people's part of it. But that networking and getting to know people is really critical.
All right. I want to thank everyone on right now. You guys are asking some great questions. Y'all are the best. Moving on here to, let's see, another one. Do you think mule deer? This is not one you probably can answer. Any issue with competition from the expansion of whitetails in Oregon affecting mule deer populations?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have a great answer on it. The two species are without question competitors. They share a diet. They can live in similar habitats. So there's a good chance that there is competition going on there. I wouldn't expect it to be the primary cause of declines widespread in Oregon. Our whitetail populations are pretty limited. they have been expanding, but I mean, they're mostly the northern blues. They're starting to get towards the Dalles now and moving south towards John Day. Um, so there's a lot of places where they're still declining. We don't have any whitetails. We don't have any elk. So competition's probably not the single silver bullet is what might be going on. But the places where whitetails do occur, one of the primary ways they might be affecting mule deer is we have a lot of competition that's going to be occurring on mule deer winter range, basically. A lot of these mule deer are going to leave, but these whitetails are staying down on their winter range year-round, eating a lot of food that now might not be available in mule deer in winter. I would expect that to be one of the primary ways that we'd see competition manifest between those two species in Oregon. The whitetails will sort of expand up the hill, and they usually end up with some disease outbreak that knocks them back pretty good. And their core populations are down there in some of that lower elevation stuff that serves as mule deer winter range. And I'd expect that to be the place most of the competition does occur. We've been trying to look at the competition at Starkey. We got a pretty limited whitetail population, but we just can't get enough of them collared. Given our small population of whitetails, we're not probably going to adequately address it there, but it is a potential factor affecting mule deer in some spots.
All right. Yeah, this last year, just as a little anecdote, I was over 10 miles back into the Eagle Caps, and coming up a river bottom jumped two whitetail deer way back in the Eagle Caps. I was not expecting them at all, and I was not really that happy to see them at all. Very unhappy. Let's see. Yeah, is buck to doe ratio an issue? How many does can a buck actually breed consistently?
A lot. They're pretty effective. There is a minimum threshold there that you need. You can't expect one buck to breed in like 100 does. But the thing there is even your ratio is not that important. It's the number of mature bucks you have because they're going to do the bulk of it regardless. So that number doesn't have to be that high. I'm not going to put an exact number on it. There has been research done on this topic related to how number of bucks in the population does influence population performance of mule deer. And this has primarily been done in Colorado. And it's been a while since I looked at the exact details of that research, but they had a couple study areas where they reduced buck harvest substantially in one and not in the other, which led to vastly different age structures. So you had a lot more older bucks in the other one versus the more of an average age buck population for a harvested group in the other. There really wasn't any difference in population performance. Does were getting pregnant usually on their first estrus cycle. Twinning rates weren't really any different. Things were basically the same. The big thing they found is a lot of bucks died of old age in the population where they stopped hunting them. So didn't really have a big reproductive performance. You were just losing hunting opportunity at that point. That's not to say you could get to a point where your buck ratio is small enough you're going to have population effects, but it's going to be a pretty small number. And off the top of my head, I'm not going to quantify that, but it'd have to be pretty low. You're going to have very few bucks left in the population to have a huge population effect.
Yeah, and then do you have any info on how deer distribution is affected during hunting season, especially how hunting pressure affects movement from public to private land?
Yeah, so I think I mentioned earlier we just had that paper published looking at doe mule deer response to buck hunting. They really don't shift their distribution substantially. They stick to the home range they've had most of the summer. The exact percentages slipping through my mind right now, but their home range during the hunting season overlapped their summer home range by greater than 50%. They really didn't move much. Deer have really high sight fidelity. They're going to stick to where they're at for the summer, and then once they finally decide to migrate, they're going to go. And the biggest change that we saw were more in behavior, sort of shifting timing of movements, seeking out cover within their home range, but it really wasn't a big distributional shift in contrast to what elk do. Elk have huge distributional shelves. They start getting pressured, they just bail. But they have way bigger home ranges. They know a wider area. And so they just don't stick to that small area that they know. And I think I mentioned earlier that those consequences of deer leaving their home ranges, they're usually a much higher predation risk when they leave and go somewhere they don't know. So mule deer just seem to sort of hold tight and stick out, what might be a bad situation as best they can. I guess that's maybe the best way to describe it. They're just going to hang out and not try and go see if the grass is greener on the other side of the hill. They're going to stick out what they got.
Right, and then I think you covered a little bit of this, but I'll expand on it a little bit. The juniper cover was kind of surprising, I think, for a lot of us, because we've heard, it's sagebrush habitat, the juniper conifer invasion, which you did talk about in some of the more forested aspects where you get that dog hair timber where that's an issue. But the juniper kind of caught us by surprise, or at least me. And we've been reducing juniper on the landscape for habitat improvement projects for other species. Is there any research that those efforts are harming mule deer? And you went over this a little bit with the slopes, but what features can be built into juniper removal project prescriptions that benefit mule deer?
So this one, I think, comes down to a lot of context on where you're at. When I was talking about the value of junipers on winter range, which is a pretty narrow slice of sagebrush country, and then also the context of once you're in winter range, some of those slopes, and this might be where juniper more naturally grew anyway, and is not where juniper is really expanding. You get more fire breaks in some of these draws. It might be a bit rockier, so the juniper might be in these areas anyway. And so it's more of a context thing. It's not saying that removing juniper is necessarily a bad thing. It's the context of knowing that some juniper on winter range for mule deer appears to be important because they're using it. And like that could be for snow interception or hiding cover, thermal cover, all sorts of things that could be going on winter range. Summer range, on the other hand, juniper is probably not a good thing. It's competing with plants. I mean, juniper as forage has zero benefit to mule deer. They won't eat it. And it competes for water. It competes for a lot of other resources. It shades out things. There's the chemicals that come off juniper that basically kill everything living underneath of it. And so the juniper removal projects is a sort of a context thing. If you're out there in those big flats where sage grouse want to be and mule deer probably want to be in the summer, removing juniper out there is probably very beneficial. But you get into some of the winter range stuff, they probably need some of it because it meets some other life history traits. Because during the winter, they're just mostly trying to survive. And if that's being able to hide underneath of a juniper tree to stay a little bit warmer or stay out of the snow, that's probably a good thing. So it's a little bit context specific there. And it's more of the thought of juniper is not a bad thing overall. It's a native plant out there. But the context of where it is matters. If it's going out into places where it's only there because of fire suppression going on for the last 80 to 100 years, that might not be where you want juniper, but if some of these canyons and stuff that deer might be wanting to winter in, that might be the appropriate place to leave it. So it's more just the thought of thinking of the context of where you might or may or may not want to actually remove it.
Yeah, and that's interesting too, because you get into, I think, the juniper with prescribed fires and air and landscapes, you're also disturbing it. And you end up selecting for annual grasses. So it'd be interesting to see which is the lesser of two evils, through your research there. So just a little comment, I guess, on that. That's just a fascinating topic. A lot of these are policy specific stuff. This is an easier one. What percentage of browse versus grass do deer eat?
Cover that one again.
Yeah, what percentage of browse versus grass do deer eat?
So it varies seasonally. During the early spring when grasses are just greening up and are most nutritious, deer are going to have a higher percentage of grass in their diet that time of year. By the time you get to fall, it's largely browse. Grass is finesse. They can't make much use of it. And then winter, it's almost all browse Everything else is senescent, doesn't have a lot of quality. So it does vary seasonally, but even during the peak times of year with grass, it's usually probably never makes up more than half their diet. They're going to be eating a lot of forbs instead. And being a biologist, wildlife biologist, I'm not that great at plants myself, so distinguishing between a forb and a grass on the ground for me in the spring is not probably the easiest thing anyway. But they are going to have a lot more forbs versus grasses. So the forbs just going to be more nutritious, have higher calorie content per bite than, say, a grass would. Particularly as you get into later summer and everything's senescing, the grasses don't hold a lot of value for mule deer. I mean, they're going to eat it if that's what's available. And that's one of the key things about mule deer is they're going to pick out the best available forage that's presented to them. So if it's all bad, they're going to take the best of the worst. If it's all really good, they're going to find the best of the best. So they're very selective browsers, and they tend to find the highest quality thing. And for them, grasses usually aren't it most of the year. And it tends to be those browse species, particularly shrubs.
All right, yeah, that's good information to have. Darren, someone said it looks like you have experience studying northern spotted owls. Any thoughts on the types of silvicultural prescriptions that would benefit both NSO and mule deer, where both species overlap? Easy one.
Well, it's been a few years on the spotted owls. I'm trying to keep myself out of trouble here. So the opportunities I exist broadly. The two species, deer and elk rely on a lot of early successional stands for forage. Spotted owls are an old growth dependent species. I'm not sure there's a lot of overlap there where you can benefit both simultaneously. I think that the question comes down to that there's places in the landscape that we have determined are going to be timber production, and then we also have late successional reserves for, say, spotted owls and species, pine martens, other things that need to have some of those older forest structures. And that's kind of where it's at. It's sort of that partitioning the landscape of how you're going to benefit one species versus the other. And, those more managed forests, that's the opportunity to benefit deer and elk, and those areas that are reserved for some of those late successional species, that's what we need to do for them. Sometimes you're between a rock and a hard place. We can't simultaneously manage to benefit every species at once.
All right, there's a lot of questions here. A lot of them are kind of policy or a little bit outside the realm of what we discussed before this. So I'll ask you one. It doesn't sound like you've done a ton of specific research on this, but you might be familiar with some research on the over versus underpass with highways on mule deer management.
So the relative benefit, which one's better or worse, I couldn't probably speak to. I would say either one is better than nothing, without question. Particularly if you can couple that with fencing, and I think mule deer have a strong drive to get to where they want to go during migration, and if they have to go under the road or over the road, if you're fencing it in and funneling them to those points, they're going to use it probably regardless. There may be some other species outside of mule deer that might be a little more finicky to which way they want to go. But during a migration path, those deer know where they want to go, and they're gonna get there either way. They're gonna walk across traffic. They're gonna go under. They're gonna go over. But I think for mule deer, the key thing is getting that fencing associated with the overpass or underpass to funnel them to that point that they're going to find a safe way to cross. And that's ultimately the big thing for them. They're going to go regardless. And if we can reduce the number of deer that are getting hit by cars, that's really going to benefit the population overall.
Yeah, I've been surprised just kind of on my own property and watch my own deer how much aversion deer have just to lower level fences. You know, it doesn't necessarily have to be a high fence to influence, for at least from what I've seen. You know, it could be wrong, influence deer travel, but they avoid 5 foot tall fences as well. They'll walk considerably around just to avoid having to jump, which I've been surprised to see. Another question for you, are you, do you have any tags or draws that you're putting in for this year? Do you get a chance to go hunting with your career field, or are you pretty locked up?
I'm still an active hunter. You're not going to know where I get to go hunting, not giving out my spots. No, I'm primarily an archery hunter. So most years do general season, and then I'll put in for draw. It's for elk. Through an archery tag. I haven't hunted with a rifle for elk in quite a while. Deer, I'll usually put in for a rifle hunt, and then I'll go archery hunting if I get the chance. Well, I'll go archery if I don't draw a tag. So, yep, still actively hunt, and continue to do so as long as I'm physically able. And I should be drawing an elk tag in Wyoming this year. So I'll be headed that direction in this fall.
Well, congrats on the Wyoming tag. I'm hoping that, that's probably next year for me in Utah. 19 years and going. You'll be putting in for a draw maybe for elk next year as well. So we'll see on that front. I think everyone had really great questions. There was still a lot of questions remaining, but we had to skip over them. Want to thank you for your time and your amazing work. This has been really eye-opening and just excellent information, and you did a just excellent job of putting an insane amount of information in a digestible package. I saw all your research ahead of time. It's part of the reason why I gave you a call, and you could have saved me a lot of time reading your research if I just would have waited for this presentation. So thanks, and we definitely appreciate it. If everyone wants to hang around for a little bit, there was a lot of questions on what we can do, and I can go over that just a little bit. Try to get a hold of ODFW, the people that go over policy, and there was a few things I was able to figure out, but this is going to be an ongoing thing, and this will be targeted in our Western regions as far as what we can personally do to help mule deer, and it'll be a point of emphasis for us. But yes, thank you, Darren, so much. I appreciate your time and the effort that went into the amazing presentation.
No, my pleasure. It's good to get what we know out there to people, and let people know what's going on. Mule deer are a challenge, and it's going to be moving forward, but we're trying to make progress and turn this around. And again, I appreciate the time. I'll go ahead and stick around, listen to what you guys still have to say, and if some more questions pop up that relate to something you think I can answer, I'll just stick around until you guys want to wrap this up. Oh, and I did notice at one point somebody asked. It is.
I don't know if it was just me, but I missed that very last part. Oh no, we lost you.
Nope. I'm back again.
You're back. Now you're the only, something crazy's going on. So as far as what we can do, that was a lot of the questions with the policy and everything. A lot of what we can do is, take the information that Darren gave us and apply it to our decision making and what policies we support. And then when it comes to boots on the grounds, being ready and able to help when it comes to habitat improvement projects orchestrated by ODFW. The stuff that we can kind of work on from a policy end is encouraging safe migration routes for mule deer on a national and local level, making sure that the vehicle collision numbers that we saw was so high gets lowered. And as far as individual hunters, just in what we do, each of us, has the opportunity for, a cougar tag each season. And while, it remains to be seen whether that's additive or not, that's a species that we can legally and sustainably take. And I personally don't spend enough time, hunting that species like I do with other species that I have a tag for. If someone wants to email if someone could put our email up in the comments, we can get back with you. We have some people that either work for ODFW or are pretty accomplished predator hunters in the state that have had high success rates hunting cougar, even with the restrictions in place in Oregon on cougar hunting. They still go out and regularly kill and harvest and eat cougars. And they do quite well on bear hunting too. So if you guys are interested, we can get you in touch with those people. And, keeping ourselves educated and making sure that we have educated discussions with other hunters and other conservationists that are non-hunters. Just basically taking, the information that Darren's given us and spreading it. When we encounter misinformation or stuff that's not backed by science, just kind of reeling that in, and so that the greatest amount of advocacy and the greatest amount of hunter voices can do the most good. Beyond that, I guess it's kind of hard because we can't hear everybody else, but does anyone have anything they want to put in the comments real quick that I didn't necessarily go over or that you'd like to see and hear before we wrap it up? Let's wait and see. All right, I think we're done. Jesse, somewhere out there managing this whole thing, I think you can cut it. And we're going to be doing a good number of these, so stay tuned. Watch your emails and our social, because we're going to put together a lot of events like this. And make sure you renew your membership or sign up if you don't have one, because that goes towards putting together events like this and then moving what we learn in events like this forward to actual action. It helps us out a lot.